Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain. Today we will be discussing the wars of the Middle East and North Africa with Kamran Bokhari, a globally renowned counter-extremism specialist who teaches national security and foreign policy courses at the University of Ottawa, and the author of Political Islam in the Age of Democratization. Welcome to our show, Kamran Bokhari. This is Zain Khan.
Thanks for having me.
Kamran, what is the historical perspective of the current Middle Eastern and North African conflict?
Well, then, a lot of people look back at the history of the Middle East, and some will go as far as back as the implosion of the Ottoman Empire and the ushering in of the nation-state era. Some people will go even further back to try and explain what's going on. But I think for the purposes of our viewers today, it's probably best to start with the 1990s. Which is much more contemporary, and it'll make a lot more sense to those listening and watching. I think that we need to begin with the 1991 Gulf War, in which the United States led a coalition against the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, which had invaded Kuwait, and that really created a crisis. In other words, what it did was that it created an imbalance between the Shia and the Sunni world, because the buffer state that the Sunni Arab countries relied on to protect themselves against an expanding or an expansionist Iran was no longer there. It was weakened. The war weakened Iraq in 1991, and then 12 years of sanctions. In the meantime, we had the 9/11 attacks, and then the United States intervened militarily into the region. Again, in Iraq, after Afghanistan. Afghanistan, as you know, was short-lived, but really the situation with Iraq was really key, because until that time, Iraq did not have an Islamist, much less a jihadist problem. But it was after the fall of the Saddam regime that we can see a vacuum being created that was quickly exploited by the predecessor to ISIS, which initially was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then things took on from there. And by the time the Arab Spring came along, what was called the Islamic State of Iraq, the predecessor group to ISIS, was ready to exploit the civil war in Syria. And since then, we've seen the growth of this group, especially right after 2013, when it decided to call itself ISIS, and then in 2014, it basically dropped the latter IS and just called itself the Islamic State, and declared the so-called Caliphate. This is after having taken large tracts of land in both Syria and Iraq. And so what we essentially have is an Arab world in chaos. And the three non-Arab powers in the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and Israel, are trying to manage this commotion in keeping with their respective national interests. Now, obviously, it's not just a regional problem. The United States, as I mentioned earlier, has been involved in this region for a very long time, and obviously it has interests as well, and therefore it works with certain countries to achieve its objectives, which is a sort of a balance of power strategy. And that also further complicates, and recently we saw the Russians jump into the fray, and therefore what we have is a very, very complex war. Now, I know it's very, that's simplifying it. That is a simplification of the, full breadth and length of the conflict. But I think that should be enough to get our listeners and viewers going in this discussion.
Kamran, this seems to be a confusing standoff between so many different countries. Some want Assad gone and some want Assad to stay. Who's on whose side, and which countries are still planning to stay neutral in the conflict?
Well, Zain, as is obvious from the conflict, there are no neutral countries. There are countries who don't know whether Assad should go or not, but I don't think that there's any country or any stakeholder in this conflict that's neutral. If you look at the list, it's pretty obvious which country is on which side. So we have Turkey wanting to overthrow Assad for their own reasons, but Turkey is also fearing the Kurds, the rise of Kurdish separatism in Syria that affects their Kurdish problem. They're also worried about ISIS, but mostly they're interested in toppling the Assad regime. Saudi Arabia also wants to topple the Assad regime, but for a different purpose, which is to roll back Iranian influence The Saudis think that if they can topple Assad, then what will happen is that they would have punched a major hole in what is the Iranian sphere of influence. They want to be able to roll back Iranian influence at a time when they are trying to make sense of the Arab commotion, the chaos in the Arab world, and they're trying to essentially prop up the various regimes that are facing internal problems. And then we have the Qataris who want the same thing, but they're allies with the Turks. UAE is on the same side. On the other hand, we have Iran, Iraq, to the extent that we can call Iraq a state. We have Hezbollah, which is a non-state actor, but the most dominant one in Lebanon, and Russia. It's in their interests of these countries and these actors that Assad regime, not Assad necessarily himself, but the regime that is represented by President Assad, remain intact to the extent that it is possible to keep it intact. And then, of course, there is the United States. The United States, on one hand, cannot do business with Assad and therefore has to move forward in terms of effecting some form of regime change. But at the same time, DC fears that if the Assad regime collapses, then that creates more space for ISIS. And of course, ISIS is the other actor in there that wants to dominate, see the fall of the Assad regime for its own purposes, to expand the boundaries of its so-called caliphate. And then there are other rebel groups, and there are just too many to list. And so what we have is a very, very complex chessboard here.
We've heard so many different militant groups operating within the region, more significantly ISIS, Kurdish rebel groups, and splinter groups of Al-Qaeda. How many groups are operating within the region?
Well, Zain, according to the Carter Center based in Atlanta, they have cataloged as many as 7,000 different factions. Now, the word group, it means different things to different people in different contexts. But if we use that word generically, the Carter Center tells us there are about 7,000 militias or factions or groups that have emerged in Syria since the beginning of the civil war in mid to late 2011. Now, over the past 4 years, not all of these groups have survived. They've merged into coalitions. Those coalitions have merged into broader alliances. It's safe to say that there are dozens, and it just depends on geography. Where exactly in Syria is a particular group active? Obviously, the biggest one of these groups is ISIS, considering that it controls a large piece of geopolitical real estate, not just in Syria, but also in Western Iraq. But within Syria, the group controls areas which are east of Aleppo, and then, the province of Raqqa, and then there's Deir ez-Zor, and then there is the central part of Syria in which, the city of Palmyra exists, and they're spread across. So what we have is a very complex battle space. There are 6 different battlefronts on which ISIS finds itself fighting with either the Assad regime or other rival rebel groups, Kurds. It's also facing airstrikes, and then they're fighting Hezbollah. They're fighting the Shiite militias that the Iranians have amassed in Syria to try and protect the Assad regime. And so this, as I said, that this is a very, very fluid and complex battle space.
Kamran, the most confusing question, which group is fighting with each other and which groups have formed alliances? These groups are also fighting against different countries. Is there a possibility that these groups are being used as proxies by different countries? If yes, then which country is using which group and against whom?
As I said, Zain, there are multiple groups. And there are most of them are proxies of different states. So if you take out IS isn't the proxy, the Daesh or ISIS or IS. It goes by different names, even ISIL. It doesn't seem to be a proxy of any regional or international state. But there are dozens of groups that are proxies. So Saudi Arabia supports certain groups. Qatar supports a certain set of groups. The UAE does as well. And then, of course, Turkey, which has the longest border with Syria, also supports different groups. There's Jordan as well. Jordan is also a staging ground for the battlefields in the southern part of Syria. And then, of course, Lebanon is being used by Hezbollah to basically try and defend the Assad regime. So Iran has its proxies. I mean, without going into sort of the names because they're just becoming confusing, it's safe to say that all of these countries have proxies. Now, on the side of on the Sunni side of the equation, different countries even overlap in terms of proxies. So there are certain groups that the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris and others jointly support. Then there are those who are supported only by a single country. And then, of course, these are competing groups. They compete with each other. They ally with one another. And one of the key sort of wild cards on this side of the proxies is that the Al-Qaeda branch of Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is also a transnational jihadist state, only so many degrees separated from ISIS, is allied with many of these rebel groups who are proxies of Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So, for example, if you look at Arar al-Sham, Arar al-Sham is perhaps the biggest rebel group in the country. It's a well-known ally of Al-Qaeda. So you have Al-Qaeda fighting IS as well, Al-Qaeda fighting alongside rebel groups against the Assad regime and against Hezbollah and the Assad regime forces. And of course, now with Russia doing airstrikes and providing some support on the ground, these groups are also trying to attack the Russian positions. We are getting some initial reports of that. So it's becoming a very complicated battlefield, and it's a dizzying landscape.
With Russia recently stepping foot into the region and starting its air raids, both Russia and America are criticizing each other's targets. Both claim that the other is specifically not targeting ISIS. Whose air raids are targeting who?
That's actually a very good question, because as I see it, and a lot of my fellow observers would agree with me, that there isn't a concerted struggle against ISIS. In other words, most of the stakeholders are not really earnestly fighting against ISIS. So let's go through the list and see what each stakeholder is doing. We have the United States, and the United States is engaged in airstrikes, in intensifying those airstrikes, and it's inserting special operations forces. It's using drone strikes, and it's, of course, intelligence operations are ongoing. But we all know that without ground forces, there's only so much the United States can achieve, and therefore ISIS continues to exist and continues to project power. If you look on the other side of this equation with Russia, Russia's interest is not in targeting ISIS necessarily, only where ISIS represents a threat to the Assad regime, or where the Russians feel that ISIS presents a threat to their national security in their near abroad, especially where they find intelligence that Chechens are fighting alongside ISIS. If you look at the Saudis, they are threatened by ISIS, but at the same time, from their point of view, the existence of ISIS is also a force multiplier. What do I mean by that? It is that the Saudis, as I said earlier, are engaged in the war in Syria to try and roll back Iranian influence. So if ISIS is putting the pressure and tightening the screws on the Assad regime, then from the Saudis' point of view, that's just a force multiplier. And the Qataris and the UAE are also willing to look the other way. For Turkey, the problem is not ISIS. The immediate problem for them are the Kurds, who are in areas that are north of where ISIS is located and right up on their border. And their interest is also in seeing the Assad regime going. In other words, being toppled. Even if you look at Iran, the Iranians are not really fighting ISIS in a concerted way either. They're fighting ISIS only to the extent where it threatens the Assad regime, and more importantly in Iraq, where it's at war with its Shiite-dominated regime in Baghdad. And so nobody is out there fighting ISIS. And there's a lot of blame game going on that, so for example, Russia is accusing Turkey of not fighting ISIS. Vice versa, the Turks are accusing the Russians of not doing the same thing. Everybody seems to be throwing the blame at each other. But at the end of the day, what is important to note is that nobody is really fighting ISIS in a concerted, coherent way, in an earnest way, and therefore the group continues to proliferate.
Kamran, with France recently retaliating for Paris attacks and Turkey shooting down a Russian fighter jet, where do you see things going from here in the future?
I think the Turkish move to shoot down the warplane of Russia over Syria, if you ask the Turks, they'll say it was over their airspace, and so that's a debatable matter. But nonetheless, the reality is that the Russian warplane was shot down by the Turks. That creates a dangerous escalation and really creates a new, if you will, front in an already very complex war. And the Russian and the Turkish issue is the clash is very important to understand. And why? Because the Turks, their imperative in Syria is to see that the Assad regime is toppled, and they're supporting groups to that effect. Now, conversely, the Russians want to salvage and support and make sure that the Assad regime does not fall. And in fact, it is engaged in some heavy airstrikes to help the Syrian military on the ground recapture as much territory back from various rebel groups as possible. And so eventually, the risk here is that as Syria pushes its imperative and the Russians push back with because of their own imperative, that these two powers can continue to clash, and we may see more clashes going on down the road. The same thing will happen even in the case of Iran and Turkey, because Iran is also supporting the Assad regime, and we see that the Turks are going to come into conflict with that. And Turkey is important here because Turkey has the longest border with Syria. Turkey cannot tolerate chaos on its southern border. It does not want to jump into the fray. It's reluctant and has been so, and even remains so as of now. But ultimately, whatever the Turks want to do will be immaterial. Objective geopolitical realities will force Turkey to play a far greater role in Syria as we move on, as the weeks and the months and the years roll on, and this conflict continues to evolve. And what that means is that's going to bring Turkey into conflict with Russia and Iran, to say the least. And this is not to say that the Turks and the Saudis and the other Sunni players in the region are all on the same page. They have their differences. But for now, I think that there is a high risk that we see a Turkish-Russian clash and, of course, a Turkish-Iranian clash.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kamran Bokhari, for being in our show.
Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
This was Kamran Bokhari, an international geopolitical analyst. He was discussing the wars of the Middle Eastern region and North Africa. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain Khan. Take care and goodbye.